Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a question that has, well, it's plagued philosophy, policy, and human existence for as long as we've had a history to record.
We're talking about the darkest, most enduring feature of our collective story.
Organized violence, mass killing, and destruction.
In a word, war.
It was probably the heaviest topic we could possibly undertake, but you can't really understand the world we live in without grappling with it.
Exactly. And our source material for this deep dive is really clear on the definition. It's not just any violence. It's organized, large-scale violence between political entities.
Right, between states or, major groups.
And it leads to the destruction of entire cities, economies, and social fabrics. And on one thing, there's a universal agreement.
That war is terrible.
Fundamentally, yes, it's a catastrophe.
Okay, so that consensus that war is a tragedy, that's the easy part.
Yeah.
But here's where we set our mission for this deep dive. This is where the real intellectual and moral friction comes in.
We're asking the really difficult question.
Is war ever morally justified? I mean, are there situations where armed force isn't just a strategic move, but actually the morally right thing to do?
Or, at the very least, the unavoidable lesser evil in a set of absolutely horrific choices.
And that tension, that's what we're exploring today.
It is. That tension between the moral ideal and what seems like strategic necessity, it drives pretty much every discussion about conflict.
So to give you a shortcut, a really thorough guide to this whole philosophical arena, we are unpacking three fundamentally different positions.
Three positions that offer radically different answers to that core question.
First, we're going to guide you through pacifism. This is the absolute stance.
War is never, ever, under any circumstances, morally justified. Full stop.
It takes the reality of violence so seriously that it just demands radical non-participation.
Then we're going to move to what's called just war theory. Some people call it JWT.
This is a really ancient tradition that tries to find a strict middle ground.
Right. It accepts that force might be necessary to stop something even worse, but it insists, absolutely insists, that war is only justified under a very stringent, multi-layered set of moral conditions.
It's all about regulating violence, not celebrating it.
And finally, we will dig into realism.
And realism basically throws cold water on that whole moral discussion.
It really does. It argues that morality is, at the end of the day, secondary to the harsh realities of power, state security, and, survival on the international stage.
So our goal here is absolutely not to give you an easy answer.
Because there really isn't one. Instead, we want to give you the analytical tools, the frameworks you need to understand this profound tension.
We want you to leave with an appreciation for the honest, difficult complexities of this debate, not just some surface-level definitions.
Yeah.
Right. So let's start with the default intuition. The thing that I think pushes most people towards a rejection of war in the first place.
Let's unpack the catastrophic reality of it, because the costs are so immediate, so pervasive, and so overwhelming.
They really are.
Our sources lay out the obvious reasons why war is considered a moral catastrophe, and it has to start with the human cost. It's never contained.
What do you mean by that, not contained?
I mean, it doesn't just kill uniformed soldiers, combatants. It always, either intentionally or through tragic, foreseeable accident, kills vast numbers of non-combatant civilians.
So that lack of discrimination, as they call it, is just. It's an intrinsic moral stain on any conflict.
It is. And then, beyond the immediate death toll, you have the complete devastation of the very foundations of human life.
You're talking about infrastructure.
Exactly. War systematically targets and destroys essential things. Homes, hospitals, schools, power grids, cultural sites. It's an act of erasure, not just military defeat.
And there's a cost that I think gets overlooked, or at least underappreciated, in the, the day-to-day news coverage.
The long-term cost.
Yeah, the trauma.
Deep, enduring, intergenerational trauma. The psychological wounds, the social wounds, they persist long, long after any treaties are signed. This isn't a temporary thing. It reshapes entire societies for decades.
And then there's the financial cost, which is just staggering.
Oh, it's almost impossible to comprehend.
You think about the resources. Trillions of dollars that are diverted away from pressing human needs.
Things like public health, fighting climate change, poverty, education.
All of that gets redirected into the machinery of destruction. It's this enormous, irreplaceable opportunity cost for civilization.
And this inherent moral catastrophe, which is already massive, is just amplified exponentially by the realities of modern conflict.
Because of the weapons we have now.
The weapons systems are terrifying. Hypersonic missiles, precision cluster munitions, autonomous weapons. The devastation that can be unleashed in minutes today is beyond anything from previous centuries. The capacity for mass destruction is now the global default.
And that capacity just fundamentally changes the moral calculus, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Especially when you combine it with the nature of modern war.
You mean how the lines are blurred?
Exactly. The line between combatant and civilian is so often blurred now. You think about urban guerrilla warfare or insurgencies where fighters just blend into the general population.
How can you morally justify force when you can't even be sure who your target is? How do you avoid hitting innocent people?
And on top of that, we're living in an age of information warfare.
Which makes it incredibly difficult for anyone, observers, citizens, even policymakers, to make an honest moral assessment of a conflict.
Information is just so tightly controlled.
Narratives are competing, propaganda is weaponized to, manufacture consent or build support. We're often operating in this thick cloud of distortion, which makes objective moral judgment almost impossible.
So when you put all of that together, the cost, the blurred lines, the propaganda, the sheer destructive power,
It becomes intellectually and morally very, very challenging for anyone to say with a straight face, yes, this specific conflict is a good thing.
and that realization is what pushes so many people towards the principled position that organized violence is always a moral catastrophe. It drives them toward pacifism.
So let's define that term really clearly. Pacifism is the view that organized violence or, intentional participation in the large-scale killing of other humans is never morally justified.
It's a radical stance, an unwavering commitment to nonviolence as an absolute moral good.
But our sources make it clear that pacifism isn't just one single idea. People arrive at it from different places for different reasons.
Okay, so what are those different motivations?
Well, the first is a profound respect for life. This is a foundational ethical stance.
So just the idea that human life is sacred.
Sacred, or at least that it holds a fundamental value that intentional killing, especially organized mass killing, always violates. For someone with this view, the moral purity of their refusal to kill outweighs any strategic advantage you might gain from violence.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the next one?
Then you have spiritual or religious conviction. This is a huge one historically.
This would be rooted in specific texts, right?
Exactly. Teachings like do not kill, love your enemies, or that deep spiritual command to overcome evil with good. This is seen as a divine or universal moral law that, supersedes the temporary self-interested demands of a state.
A higher law, basically.
A higher law.
Yeah.
Then there's a third motivation, which is maybe a bit more pragmatic. It's called practical skepticism.
So this isn't born from religious faith.
No, it's born from a deep disappointment with human history. A skeptic might say, okay, maybe in some perfect theoretical scenario where a war was perfectly controlled and limited, maybe it could be justified.
Right.
But in the real world, it never works out that way. In practice, war always spirals out of control. It always harms the innocent. And crucially, it's inevitably corrupted by, economic interests, political ambitions, pure hatred.
So any noble reason you had for starting it becomes irrelevant once the fighting actually begins.
Exactly. They reject it based on its real-world outcome, not its theoretical possibility.
Okay, there's a fourth one.
The fourth is what you could call the long-term vision. This is the recognition of the devastating cycle of violence.
The idea that violence just creates more violence.
Precisely. Every war, even a supposedly just one, plants the seeds for future wars. It creates new grievances, new enemies, new justifications for retaliation down the line. Pacifism is a refusal to keep participating in that generational cycle of revenge.
It's important to get specific about the line that pacifism often draws, though.
That's a great point. The sources suggest that many forms of pacifism do allow for individual physical self-defense.
So like pushing an attacker away or disarming someone.
Right, using force to prevent immediate harm to yourself or someone else, but they draw a very hard, bright line at large-scale, state-sanctioned, organized killing.
It's the organization and the scale that transform it into an unacceptable moral evil for them.
And the undeniable strength of pacifism is its unwavering commitment to seeing the horror of war for what it is.
It really holds humanity accountable.
It does. It constantly demands that we seek real nonviolent systemic alternatives, strengthening diplomacy, empowering international law, promoting effective nonviolent resistance movements.
But that deep commitment to principle,
Mm.
that brings us to the central, devastating challenge that pacifism has to face.
Extreme cases.
The reason why so many people, I think, just can't fully adopt it.
This is the crushing dilemma. What is the moral response to a genocidal regime? a state that is actively trying to enslave or exterminate an entire population.
Is it morally acceptable to refuse violent defense, even if you know your refusal guarantees that innocent people will be annihilated?
And for you, the listener, this is that moment where abstract theory just crashes headfirst into brutal reality.
If the only tool that can stop a systemic mass murder operation is military force, does the pacifist refusal to use it become a form of complicity with the atrocity?
This is the core tension. This is the point where the majority of people start to move towards the idea that maybe, just maybe, some force is necessary.
So what's the pacifist counter-argument to that? How do they respond?
Their counter-argument is just as principled as their stance on war itself. First, they would argue that history shows nonviolent resistance, while incredibly difficult and requiring immense courage, can be surprisingly powerful.
So things like mass strikes, civil disobedience.
Exactly. They can weaken oppressive regimes over time, often without the horrific unintended consequences that come with military intervention.
They would also argue that interventionist wars, even ones started with the best intentions, often just escalate the chaos.
Right. They can prolong the suffering, displace huge populations, and often leave the situation even worse than when the intervention began.
But there's a deeper philosophical point they make, isn't there?
There is. This is the most profound part of their rebuttal. They argue that the moral calculus is already broken if you have to do wrong. That is, commit organized mass killing in order to prevent wrong.
So by committing the evil of war, you've already lost the moral high ground.
You've already lost the moral battle, even if you achieve a desirable outcome. They are committed to maintaining moral purity, even at the cost of what seems like a practical consequence.
And that really highlights the enduring power of pacifism.
Mm.
It demands this absolute moral standard.
But the sheer weight of the consequences in the face of mass atrocity, that is precisely why a huge portion of ethical tradition developed the next system we have to explore.
The attempt to regulate and limit that necessary force. Just war theory.
So just war theory, or JWT, is this vast philosophical and legal tradition. It stretches all the way back to early Christian thinkers like Augustine, and then was later formalized by people like Thomas Aquinas.
It's been around for a very long time.
A very long time. And it's an ancient attempt to reconcile two very difficult truths in what these philosophers called a broken world.
Okay, what are the two truths?
The first truth is the pacifist truth.
Yeah.
That war is a terrible evil. It's a monumental moral failure every time it happens.
And the second truth?
The second is the realist truth. That sometimes the use of force might be the only available tool to prevent an even greater evil from happening.
Like enslavement or systemic oppression or genocide.
Exactly. So JWT is absolutely not a celebration of war. Its entire purpose is to severely limit and morally regulate it.
It's basically saying, if force is necessary, if the very existence of a people or a fundamental moral principle is under threat,
then and only then may you consider war, and only if you adhere to the strictest possible moral standards.
and this framework is the foundation of a lot of modern international law, right?
It is. And it's traditionally divided into two main, equally important components. First, you have to assess the morality of even starting the war.
Right.
That's called justus ad bellum.
Justice of going to war.
Right. And second, you have to determine the morality of how that war is actually fought. That's jus in bello.
Justice in the conduct of war.
And here's where we need to dive into the technical details, because this is so important. The criteria for jus ad bellum are not suggestions. They are 6 strict, interconnected gates that all must be passed for a war to be even potentially justified.
Okay, let's walk through them. Let's start with the moral foundation. Just cause. What does the source material say counts as a just cause?
It has to address a serious, undeniable wrong. Historically, the primary accepted reasons are pretty clear.
Self-defense.
Self-defense against direct aggression is the big one. Then there's the recovery of something unjustly taken, or in more modern terms, the protection of innocent lives from large-scale, massive injustice.
And crucially, this means war for trivial reasons is out.
Immediately disallowed. Things like revenge or national honor or simple territorial disputes that aren't an existential threat, none of those qualify.
Okay, number 2 is legitimate authority.
This is all about accountability. War cannot be declared by private groups or militias or individuals, even if their cause seems just to them.
So who can declare it?
Only properly constituted public authorities. Usually that means a recognized government or an international body like the UN Security Council.
And this is where we run into our first modern problem with JWT, right?
It's a huge one. In theory, it's simple. But in practice, who holds legitimate authority today? Is it just a national government acting on its own?
Or does the moral legitimacy of a modern conflict require international consensus, specifically through the UN?
Exactly. The sources note that when nations bypass the UN, it severely compromises this criteria. It turns the action into a much more contentious unilateral intervention.
Okay, the third gate is right intention. This one sounds tricky.
It is perhaps the most challenging standard because it deals with the sincerity of your motive. The aim of the war must genuinely be justice, or the restoration of peace, or the protection of the innocent.
And it must explicitly exclude what?
It has to exclude base motives, things like revenge, conquest, glory, or economic profit. If your primary motive is to get rich or grab territory, the war is morally tainted from the very beginning, even if you could claim it was defensive.
And this is where the realists would just jump in and laugh, right?
Absolutely. A realist would argue that right intention is almost always the first criteria to be ignored in practice, because state motives are rarely, if ever, pure.
That's a good challenge to keep in mind. How can a state, which is made up of so many different interests, ever claim a pure intention?
Well, JWT holds that they must at least strive for it, even if perfection is impossible.
Okay, next up is a big one. Last resort.
This is the cornerstone of responsible action. It's the recognition that war is the ultimate moral failure.
So all reasonable nonviolent options have to be tried first.
Tried, exhausted, and failed. Robust diplomacy, international negotiations, crippling economic sanctions, political pressure, all of it must be seriously attempted.
The goal here is to show, through your actions, that military force is truly the final, desperate tool, not the first or easiest option.
If a diplomatic pathway still holds any reasonable chance of success, then going to war is, by this definition, unjust.
Okay, what's the fifth principle?
The fifth is reasonable chance of success. This can sound cold, but it's deeply moral.
How so?
War should not be launched if it is clearly destined to fail to achieve its just cause. A military action that is only going to create more suffering, more death, and more destruction with no real possibility of achieving the stated goal.
Like a vastly outmatched nation choosing a suicidal attack.
Exactly. That's deemed unjustified because it violates the core principle of minimizing harm, and it disrespects the lives of the soldiers you're sending to die for nothing.
So even a noble sacrifice, if you know beforehand that it's going to be futile, is morally questionable under JWT.
Precisely. And that leads to the final criterion, number 6, proportionality, pre-war.
This is a cost-benefit analysis that has to be done before a single shot is fired.
A crucial one. The expected good that will result from the war must substantially and demonstrably outweigh the expected harm.
Harm meaning the costs in lives, infrastructure damage, political destabilization.
All of it. Let's make this distinction really clear with an example. Imagine a nation is facing a localized border dispute. The gain is small a piece of territory.
Okay.
But winning that dispute requires military action that risks provoking a much wider conflict, maybe involving nuclear-capable powers. The potential cost is massive.
Then the war is unjustified on the basis of pre-war proportionality.
Exactly. Even if the cause itself was just. It's a harsh calculation of suffering versus gain. And if even one of these 6 criteria is not met, just war theory holds that going to war is morally wrong.
It's an incredibly stringent moral filter. It's designed to make sure war is only undertaken with, fear and trembling, not lightly or cynically.
That's a powerful set of constraints just to start a conflict, but we have to emphasize meeting all 6 only justifies the initial decision.
Right. The fighting itself has to follow its own strict moral limits.
Which brings us to the second, and perhaps even more difficult, moral check. Jus in bello.
Justice in war.
This second set of principles governs the conduct of the war, the rules of engagement. Even in a justly started war, you don't get a blank check for unlimited violence.
And the first and most challenging principle here, especially today, is discrimination, or distinction.
This is the absolute foundation of non-combatant immunity. It means you must target enemy combatants, those actively participating in the war, and you must absolutely not intentionally target civilians.
The ethical distinction there is critical. Combatants, by fighting, have forfeited their immunity.
While non-combatants retain theirs. But the difficulty of applying this today is just immense.
How do you distinguish a military barracks from a school that was built right next door? Or a civilian factory that's producing military uniforms?
This concept of dual-use infrastructure constantly strains the discrimination principle. It forces militaries to make agonizing split-second decisions about who or what is a legitimate target.
And this has led to the development of the concept of collateral damage.
Right. Which is the unintended but foreseen harm to non-combatants during a legitimate attack on a military target. JWT doesn't prohibit all collateral damage, but it requires that the damage be truly unintended.
And that it be strictly judged against the next principle.
Proportionality in conduct.
Okay, so the second principle is proportionality in conduct. And this is different from the pre-war proportionality we just talked about.
Very different. Ad bellum proportionality asks if the whole war is worth starting. In bello proportionality asks if the specific force used in this battle against this military objective is excessive.
Can you give us a concrete example of that?
Sure. Imagine a legitimate enemy objective is a small enemy radar station in a remote, unpopulated area. Using a single precision missile strike to take it out would be proportionate.
Okay, that makes sense.
However, using a small tactical nuclear weapon to achieve the exact same result, destroying that tiny radar station, would be grossly disproportionate to the tactical gain.
So the conduct of the battle would be unjust, even if the war itself was justly started.
Exactly. It's a continuous, moment-by-moment moral check on every single military decision made during the conflict. It demands that the harm caused by a specific action doesn't outweigh the concrete, immediate military advantage you gain.
Okay, and the third principle of jus in bello.
The third is a hard stop.
Yeah.
A prohibition against intrinsically evil means.
So some things are just always off the table.
Absolutely forbidden, regardless of how noble your goal is. This includes acts that violate the very dignity of humanity.
We're talking about torture, mass rape, biological weapons.
Extermination, deliberate terror campaigns targeting civilian morale, all of it. This acts as a firewall.
So even if a commander could argue that torturing a prisoner might provide intel that saves lives.
JWT holds that the act of torture itself is fundamentally intrinsically wrong and therefore it's forbidden. Period.
So JWT provides this highly detailed structural attempt to keep some moral light shining in the deep darkness of war. It's all about limiting, regulating, and demanding accountability.
That is the intention. But we have to address the very potent modern criticisms of just war theory.
Right, especially concerning how technology and modern politics make these rules almost impossible to apply perfectly.
Let's go back to the discrimination principle. Can modern warfare truly protect civilians when targets are often mobile, infrastructure is all interconnected, and weapons have such wide blast radii?
Critics would argue that the gap between the ideal of distinction and the reality of modern combat is just too vast now. The principle can't hold any meaningful moral weight.
And we have that lingering problem of right intention. Critics of JWT always ask, in a world of real politic, can a nation's motives ever truly be just about justice and protection?
Governments are complex. They're driven by internal politics, economic needs, resource competition.
So when a government says, we're intervening for freedom, the realist immediately asks, okay, but what economic or strategic interest is hidden behind that noble rhetoric?
There's also a powerful tension within JWT itself, isn't there? Between jus ad bellum and jus in bello.
A deep one. If a war is fundamentally unjust, say, a war of pure conquest, is a soldier who is fighting justly in that war, following all the rules of conduct, still morally compromised?
That's a tough question.
It is. Traditionally, JWT says that the soldier obeying in bello rules is morally accountable only for their own actions, not for the unjust cause of their leaders.
But many ethical thinkers argue that just participating in an unjust project is inherently contaminating.
Which is why discussions of war crimes now often extend to politicians and planners, the ad bellum decision makers, not just the soldiers on the battlefield.
And finally, what about the assessment of proportionality in last resort?
Well, critics, especially realists, claim that these assessments are often just manipulated. A government that already wants to go to war can simply understate the projected costs to make it look proportional.
And exaggerate the failure of nonviolent options to claim it's the last resort.
Exactly. It becomes moral window dressing rather than a genuine moral check.
But despite all these valid criticisms about how it's applied, JWT is still the central way we talk about a justified war.
It remains the central framework.
Yeah.
Militaries, political leaders, international legal bodies, they all use this language. It sets the standard, even if that standard is often violated. It provides the language for ethical accountability.
Okay, so we've covered pacifism, which rejects force outright, and just war theory, which tries to regulate it. Now we need to turn to the third perspective, which fundamentally challenges the premises of both.
Realism.
Realism.
Realism views the world through the coldest possible lens. It operates entirely outside of the ethical concerns of JWT.
So the core argument is what?
That war is not primarily a moral or ethical question. It is fundamentally about power, security, and survival. It's strategy first, morality second, if at all.
The realist tradition goes way back
Okay.
to thinkers like Thucydides, Machiavelli.
Hobbes. They describe the international system as anarchic. Now, they don't mean chaos in the streets. They mean the absence of a higher, universally accepted governing authority.
There's no global police force that can consistently enforce rules or morality on powerful states.
Exactly. And so states operate purely based on self-interest. And they define that self-interest as survival and the maintenance of power. Each state must prioritize its own security and its own national interests above all else.
Because if it doesn't, another state will take advantage of it.
Precisely. And this distinction is crucial. You have what's called descriptive realism, which just argues that this is how states do behave.
And then you have prescriptive realism.
Which argues this is how states ought to behave to ensure their survival. Both versions hold that pursuing some abstract moral goal at the expense of your own national security is, well, suicidal folly.
So this leads to the stark realist warning about all the moral language we use when we talk about war.
Yes. Realists argue that terms like just cause, protection, freedom, they're often just propaganda.
Rhetorical tools.
Tools used to sell strategic moves or territorial grabs or resource acquisition to a domestic public that needs a moral reason to support a war.
You know, the value of realism is pretty undeniable. It serves as this necessary, sobering warning against being too naive.
It reminds us that states rarely have completely clean hands, that political actions are often driven by messy, complicated self-interest that's just disguised as a noble cause.
It forces you to ask that key question, cui bono. Who benefits from this moral claim?
But there's a huge risk if we fully accept realism as our only guide.
What's the risk?
We risk treating war purely as a cynical game of chess, a zero-sum calculation of power, entirely forgetting the monumental, irreversible moral weight of human suffering that comes with every single conflict.
So many philosophers would say that while realism is a great description of how states often behave, and it's a vital tool for analysis,
It's a poor and insufficient guide for how states ought to behave. You can't just ignore the morality of war simply because it's often violated.
okay, let's try to apply these competing views, pacifism, JWT, and realism, to the ultimate moral dilemma of modern conflict.
Humanitarian intervention.
This is that controversial case where war is considered not for self-defense, but solely to protect people in another country from mass atrocities.
For supporters of humanitarian intervention, the argument is often framed in terms of a shared humanity.
The idea that if a state is systematically slaughtering its own people or failing to prevent mass killing within its borders, outside forces might be morally justified.
Or perhaps even obligated to intervene militarily.
They believe that national sovereignty is not a shield for crimes against humanity.
Exactly. The concept of a border can't protect a regime that has forfeited its moral standing by attacking its own population. In their eyes, not intervening in the face of a genocide is a profound moral failure.
This is the concept often called the responsibility to protect, or R2P.
It is. It argues that the international community has a secondary responsibility when a state fails its primary one. But this is where the realist critiques just come roaring to the front.
The critics respond with a lot of skepticism.
Profound skepticism. They point out that these interventions are almost always selective and politically motivated.
Why intervene in Kosovo, but maybe ignore another conflict that's equally devastating?
Because it lacks strategic importance, or it involves powerful allies. This selectivity, they argue, proves that the intervention is about national interest, not pure humanitarian concern.
They also argue that military action, even for genuinely good reasons, often just destabilizes the region and makes the chaos worse.
Right. Interventions carry immense risks. They can lead to power vacuums, prolonged insurgencies, or even a humanitarian disaster that's worse than the one it tried to prevent.
Which is a direct violation of the ad bellum proportionality principle we talked about.
And they powerfully remind us that humanitarian language can very frequently mask deeper strategic or economic interests. The country that intervenes to save lives might coincidentally ensure regional stability that benefits its trade routes.
Or secures access to valuable resources.
Exactly. And this clash leaves us with this agonizing moral bind.
Is it more wrong to intervene violently, with all the immediate costs and unintended consequences? Or is it more wrong to stand by passively and watch while thousands or millions are systematically murdered?
And our sources are crystal clear on this. Both action and inaction in this scenario carry heavy, heavy moral costs. There is no clean, morally pristine option.
The choice is often between an action that causes immediate tangible evil, which is war, and inaction that enables a far greater slow-motion evil, which is genocide.
And now let's pivot and look at how technology is just fundamentally challenging all three of these frameworks.
Pacifism, JWT, and realism. Technology is changing the very definition of what war is.
And who can even be held accountable for it? The rise of drones and remote warfare, for instance, has completely upended the ethical relationship between the attacker and the attacked.
The operators are sitting thousands of miles away.
Totally detached from the immediate horror and risk of combat, it makes the act of killing emotionally distant almost.
Like a video game.
Like a video game. And this remote conflict radically strains the principles of just war theory.
No, so...
It complicates the idea of courage and risk sharing, which was historically just an inherent part of being a combatant. Critics argue that when only one side is actually risking their life, the very concept of a fair fight, or even the moral justification for force, is weakened.
And what about the Josem in bello principles? Discrimination and proportionality.
Drones challenge those too. While a drone strike can be surgically precise, it's only as moral as the intelligence that's informing it.
So if the intelligence is flawed...
Or if the algorithms used to define a combatant are too broad, then the ability to protect civilians is severely compromised, no matter how accurate the technology is.
And this brings up that profound moral issue of attribution or accountability.
It does. In a remote war, when a civilian casualty occurs, who is morally and legally responsible? Is it the pilot who pulled the trigger?
Or the intelligence analyst who flagged the target? The commander who authorized the strike? The politician who set the rules of engagement?
The physical and emotional distance creates an ethical accountability gap.
And beyond just drones, technology is blurring the line between war and peace entirely. It's pushing conflict into what some call the gray zone.
We are now constantly engaged in non-military conflict methods. Sanctions that cripple entire economies, information warfare designed to destabilize political systems,
and widespread cyberattacks and cyber sabotage against critical infrastructure.
These methods are happening all the time, below the threshold of a declared kinetic war, but they can cause massive, tangible damage. Power grids failing, financial systems freezing, hospitals losing their data.
And this modern complexity makes that foundational question, is war ever justified? Even harder to answer.
Because we're struggling to define when war even begins and who counts as a combatant in a digital conflict.
Let's think about how cyber warfare specifically challenges the discrimination principle. How do you distinguish between a digital combatant, a state hacker shutting down military communications, and a non-combatant?
Like a civilian programmer working on the national power grid, or even just a private hacker acting for criminal gain. The clear lines of JWT just vanish in the digital realm.
And it challenges legitimate authority and last resort.
Because cyberattacks often provide plausible deniability, it's extremely hard to prove who is behind it.
Which makes it impossible to meet that ad bellum requirement of knowing who to hold accountable, let alone demonstrating that all peaceful options have been exhausted when the attack itself is constant and undeclared.
We've really moved from medieval concepts of chivalry and distinction to this new world of remote algorithmic warfare and constant digital conflict.
And it just necessitates a total reevaluation of what constitutes a just act of war in the 21st century.
So we've completed our deep dive into the three fundamental ways to answer this question of war's justification. We've moved from the moral rejection of pacifism
through the stringent regulations of just war theory.
And into the stark, cold analysis of realism.
You know, when political leaders or historians look back on a conflict, they sometimes speak of a just war, or a necessary war, or a war that saved lives in the long run.
But our sources really insist that this terminology has to always be accompanied by a profound sense of humility.
Every war, even one that is deemed necessary, is still, without exception, a moral tragedy.
It's full of profound, painful compromise. I think the most honest summary we can offer is that war is, at its absolute best, sometimes the least horrible option in a violent world that's already full of injustice and aggression.
And even when it is chosen as that lesser evil, it demands humility, grief, and a profound, visible moral responsibility from those who choose it.
Never triumphalism, never celebration. The scale of the cost requires a permanently sobering perspective.
So let's synthesize that core moral tension one final time for you, the listener. Pacifism demands radical nonviolence, absolute moral purity.
Which is a comforting principle until it comes face to face with true genocidal horror.
Then you have just war theory. It argues that war might be justified, but only in rare extreme cases, and only under incredibly strict moral and legal conditions.
It's an acknowledgement that we live in a broken world where perfect moral options are often impossible.
And finally, realism posits that while all these moral frameworks are nice to talk about, states will ultimately wage war based on their interests.
And that moral talk is mostly just decoration used to justify moves for power.
A thoughtful conclusion, then, has to acknowledge the immense gravity of that choice. War is a disaster, and it should be treated as such. Never romanticized, never taken lightly.
Never, ever used as a first option. If force is ever justified, it can only be as a true last resort after honest, verifiable attempts at peace have failed.
And only with meticulous attention to justice, proportionality, and the protection of innocent civilians.
And crucially, those who wage war, even for what they believe is a just cause, must carry a deep sense of responsibility, a sense of sorrow, and a willingness to be held fully accountable for the catastrophic consequences, both intended and unintended.
So this leaves us, the listener, sitting with this necessary, inescapable moral tension. It is comforting to hold to that absolute moral principle: war is never justified.
Until you face the reality of an aggressor who is bent on annihilation.
And conversely, it is deeply, deeply dangerous to grant permission for war by saying war is sometimes justified.
Because we must never underestimate how easily humans and states abuse that permission, using the noble language of just cause to mask their own self-interested, ignoble ends.
The most honest stance, then, is a perpetual state of striving.
Striving to build a political and social world where organized violence becomes less and less thinkable.
And if that unthinkable choice must finally be made, if war is truly the last desperate resort, it must only be done with fear and trembling.
Fully aware that the action you are choosing is a fundamental tragedy, a moral injury to the world, regardless of the cause. That is the true, devastating weight of a necessary war.